Hey, what's up guys? Leonardo Ribeiro here and I hope you are doing fine today. So in this video we're gonna talk a little bit about context APIs. So let's get started. So right now I'm just gonna create a new React app using create React app context API app. Okay, the app is created now, so let's set it in context and open code. Awesome. And before we run the app, I'll delete this CSS, test, and service work files. And I'll remove this dependence that we no longer have in our components here. Hello world. And here as well. Then if we start our app with yarn start, we will be able to see the hello world that we just created here. Okay, so basically context API was created to easily manage our state and share this state data between different components or not related components. Before that, we were used to create a state in a container component or stateful component and pass this data down with props inside the child components. And after that, we also had Redux, mobx, and Flux to help us to manage the state with a single data flow and so on. But React wanted to keep things simple, and instead of using third-party libraries, they built context API their own. And now, instead of using Redux or Flux or something like that, they can just use context API. So with context, you can, for instance, have a single context that have all the data for your app, if your app is small, of course. In case of bigger apps like Facebook, they can have more than one context, and even components using multiple contexts inside of it. Okay, so right now we're gonna create our first context, which will be a counter with increment functionality. Okay, so let's get started here. The first thing that I'm gonna do is create a new file called counter context.js. We're gonna import React. We're gonna have const counter context equals react dot create context. And it can be empty, or you can pass down here a default value. For instance, let's say that you wanna have const counter equals, will be an object with count equals 0, and you can pass this down here, counter. And when we use this values inside of our components, you will not have to create a new start value there. So I'm gonna export both the start value and our counter context. I'll save it, and I'll import in this app.js here. Okay, so we just created our first context file and context using context API. And now we have to manage this data, right? And the first thing that we're gonna talk about related to our choosing our context inside our components is the provider. Provider is basically a context component that will take care of updating the context data. And it will work basically the same way as Flux and Redux by using a single way data flow. But instead of having actions and reducers and state, we will have this counter context dot provider here, which will have a value prop here where you can pass this dot state, for instance. Okay, so now we have our provider here wrapping up our app component. And the second thing that we will need to use this data here is to map our initial state on this counter value that we defined under our counter context file. So after putting this provider here, we'll create our constructor, pass our props down. This dot state will be equals our counter here. Okay, so the next thing we're gonna talk about here is our consumers. Basically, the consumers will be the components that will consume the data that we just defined. And we can, for instance, create a new file here, which will be our counter.js, and this will be the actual component that will consume our data. So I'm gonna import React here, and I'll import our context as well. So for our consumers, there's two ways to create a consumer. The first one only works with one single context and only with class components, which is like this. We're going to create our counter, extend our react.component, and here the really fancy thing that we're going to add is counter.context type equals counter context. And after that, we're gonna export default our counter. Now let's create our render method here, which will return to us a div with our counter, which will be this.context.count. And inside our index.js, one thing that we're gonna do differently here is to create a new component, the app, which will be a functional component, and we're just gonna use it to wrap up. And one more thing that we're gonna do here is to create a new component called the app, which will be a functional component, and we'll only use that to wrap up our counter component with our app component. I'm going to import the counter component here. And save it. And instead of using app, we're going to use the app. Oh yeah, I forgot to put this .props.children here. So our counter will appear here. Okay, great. Let's take a look. And yeah, it works. Hello 0, which will be our initial value. But how can we update the values inside of our context files? So to do that, we're gonna use our app component, which takes our provider, and this provider here will take care of passing down this new values to our context. So let's create a new method inside our constructor here, or it could be outside as well. Let's see, increment counter, and this dot set state counter will have this dot state dot count plus 1. And now instead of using counter, we're gonna put an object here. We will destructor our counter and also add this increment method here, which will be this dot increment counter dot bind this. Okay, so what happened when I do this? We basically are adding a new key with a method to increment this counter value here. Remember our initial value? Right. So we're gonna have this object, and inside of this object we are adding a new method called increment, which will basically be this increment counter inside of this class. And when we do that, we are changing the value of our context and passing down with the provider value prop. And when we do that, context type, which is this dot context, we will be able to use that method that we just created. So let me put this on click here event, and we're gonna call this dot context dot increment, and let's see how it will look like. Oh yeah, I've just passed a wrong key here. It should be count and it was counter. Okay, so after changing that, let's see how it will look like. Right, and it will work fine. And the same thing we can do with another component here, like for instance fancy counter.js, where we're gonna import our context. We're gonna create another class, and we will render a div which will have a style of color like green. And inside of this one, we're gonna have this dot context dot count. Here's the fancy number, and we can't forget to attach this counter context to our context type attribute here, which will have counter context. We're gonna export this component, and inside of index.js we will have this fancy, we're gonna have this fancy counter right here, and we should see like this. And what is interesting about it is that we can put another on click here, with the same method that we defined before, which is increment, right? Yeah, that's it. And if we click on this new component, it will update both, not only this one. So why is this happening? Because we have this app as the provider of information for our context. So whatever we passed inside this counter context provider, a class if and only if you want to use this context type prop for our React component class. And whenever we call this method here, we are updating this component state and updating as well our counter context data. That's why we are able to see both updating, since both are receiving the same updated data. But it's not just like that. And one more thing that I have to tell you is that by using this method here to get the data, we are only able to have one and a single one context provider here. But what if we wanted to have like more than one context? Then we will have to use something like this. We'll take it off and we're gonna use our consumer component from the context API, which should look like counter context.consumer, and inside of this consumer component we're gonna have a method that will give us an object that represents this object right here. So we're gonna keep receiving our count data and our increment method inside of that function that we just defined here. Okay, like this. And I'm gonna destruct this value that we're gonna have here to count and increment. And then we're gonna return our actual component. So I'm just gonna use the same thing that we've just defined here, but instead of using this.context, we're gonna use increment directly and count directly. And again, we're gonna say hello from our fancy consumer. Let's see how it will look like. Oh yeah, and it works the same way. But the thing that I like most about using this method right here is that we don't have necessarily use a class component. So let's say, so for instance, instead of using fence counter, we could use like const fence counter, and it will receive props as an usual function component. And let me delete this, and we're gonna return like this. Okay. Now if I save it and refresh the page, it should look the same thing and works like the same way. Okay? Okay, so remember when I told you that we can use multiple contexts inside different components? So I've just did a small change here. I've basically created another context here, which will be our color context. We will have this default value passing down with the color red. And we're gonna have a provider class here, which will work basically the same way that we had our app working before. And inside this, we're gonna have a method for toggle blue and red to this color. Yeah, that way. And I've basically took the, let me rename this to color provider. Okay, perfect. And the same thing for our counter provider. I've basically refactored our app.js file, took all the provider logic from there, and put inside another class called counter provider here. And now inside of our app.js, we can use our providers here. And right here, we're gonna pass down our counter provider. Oops. I have to close it. Oops. Yep, like that. And inside of our counter provider, we also can pass down our color provider. Can you see where we are going now? And now, whatever we have inside our this.props.children inside of our app, if this child component has a consumer related to color, to our color context or our counter context, you will be able to change that and use the data all with different components, not related to a container component as we always wanted. So let me see this counter here. Okay, so for this one, we will only be able to use our counter context because we are using context type, not a consumer component here. And as I've told before, when you use this method to consume data, we are not able to use more than one context for this component. But for this method right here, yes, we are able to use more than one context. Let me take off these brackets here. Okay, and inside of this method that we used from the counter context or counter context consumer, we're gonna create another one with color context dot consumer and do basically the same thing that we did before. Let's see. Okay, so I've just misspelled that. Instead of toggle blue red, we're gonna call this toggle color right here. And it should work fine. Let's see. Oh yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So as you can see, we are using two different providers from two different contexts inside of not related components. And that's how Context API works. So don't forget, basically the Context API, you define your data, you create your providers, which will give you abilities to consume the data that you just defined, and you update this data as well. So I hope you have enjoyed, and if you enjoyed, leave your like and subscribe, so that way I can know that I'm doing a good job with you guys. Okay, so see you till the next time. Bye bye.